Hello, I am Dennis Garcia. I'm editor-in-chief of Hardware Asylum, which is at hardwareasylum.com. This is a website where I do articles on computer components, and these are the ones that you use to build computers. So motherboards, video cards, coolers, cases. I've been doing it for 20 plus years. Hardware Asylum is the latest name. The first website that I started was called ninjalane.com, and Ninja Lane doesn't really say anything about computer hardware. So in 2012, I rebranded to Hardware Asylum. I do love computer hardware. I do a lot of system builds as part of my work. So obviously, if I need to test a motherboard, then I need to actually put a computer together. I do a lot of hardware modifications as part of that. When I started Ninja Lane, it was a modding site where I would take a computer case and then improve the cooling or change the color. That allowed me to get into doing automotive style paints, and a lot of Dremel work, and a lot of sheet metal work as well. I do a lot of overclocking. Darren over here likes to say that I am a competitive overclocker. I'm nationally ranked, or internationally ranked, if you want to consider that. I have posted a lot of scores on this website called HardwareBot, which tracks these scores for benchmarks. And yesterday on the expo floor, I was doing some dry ice overclocking, and that allows you to take acetone or rubbing alcohol and you put dry ice nodules in there, and it will cool a big copper pot to allow you to get your processor down below zero. In this case, it was down to negative 50 degrees centigrade. And a lot of people ask me this question, and I just kind of have to put it up here, and it's like, no, I will not fix your computer. So last Hack For It, well, not the last one, but Hack For It 2019, Darren and I did a presentation on getting the most from your computer. And it was really kind of thinly veiled as an overclocking sort of presentation where I talked about how you would overclock a computer and why you'd want to do it. But we got a question from the audience, which was, is there any collectible hardware? And Darren started off talking about collectible cars. So obviously you can, desirable cars will be more collectible and more desirable than kind of your beater Escort and stuff like that. And the person got a little glassy eyed, is like, well, he wasn't really getting what he was wanting. So my response was, no, there's no collectible hardware because it eventually becomes obsolete and it'll tend to wear out. And it was a bit of a hypocritical answer because as I run Hardware Asylum, I have a large collection of computer hardware, including motherboards and video cards, and some of them are one-offs. So there might be 5 of them in the world. And while my response was accurate in that these motherboards are not really usable in today's technology, they are collectible because they have value to me. So obviously you can collect it because it's rare and unique. And I have a couple of notes in here. It's like you can collect anything. Some items are more desirable than others. Obviously, we just got done with a presentation about shoes. Jordans are very popular with certain people that like shoes, and other people like me is like, I don't really care. But of course, collections often reflect financial stability. When I was a young lad in college, I didn't have a lot of money, so I would wheel and deal with my computer components. So when I had a 486, for instance, and I wanted to play a certain game, I needed to upgrade. Well, I couldn't actually go and buy a motherboard, so I would take the system apart, go and sell the components to somebody and build them a computer in the process, though I still won't fix your computer. And then go out and buy the components that I want. As I've become a little bit more flush with cash and have a larger collection of stuff, I don't need to do that anymore. I can actually go buy them in the retail markets. And of course, the reasons to collect, obviously, they're either to impress others or it's because you really, really enjoy something. Now, in terms of retro PCs, I wanted to talk about nostalgia. And I'm going to draw a parallel between retro PCs and muscle cars. So with a muscle car, there's a certain generation of folks that know what they are. They know why they're cool. They might have even owned one, modified one. And there's another generation of folks that have no idea what a muscle car is. They maybe have never driven one. They've never seen one. So we have different memories of that. Well, and of course we have muscle cars that could be considered death traps because they're not very safe, which is why they're not made anymore. But for a certain generation, they find them collectible, so they hold on to them. And of course, if they go and drive them around, they worry that somebody might run into them, because now we can't actually replace the door panel anymore. The insurance companies are not as forgiving as we are in terms of our collections. So if we get into an accident to the point where it breaks a windshield, they might total the car out regardless of what it is. We have the efficiency versus usefulness. In terms of retro PCs, we have old computers that, while we can play old games on them, we can't get on the internet anymore because technology has changed to the point where we can't actually do anything. Same with the muscle car. It's a bit inefficient in the way that it works, but some people like that. I have in here that new generations remember things differently from a different perspective. You know, I grew up in the era of muscle cars, so I have a certain recollection of that. And my son, he's never even seen one. So he doesn't really have that same sort of mentality. And I have in here, these are my notes, by the way. Many of us have used old computers, and it can be a really painful experience. At my expo table, which I encourage you to go and check out after this, I have a Pentium 133. And when I put that project together, it was a project that I called the scam case, which we'll talk about a little bit later. All the while I was installing Windows 95 on it, it was painful for me to the point where I wanted to upgrade it. It's like I had a 133 megahertz processor in there, and all I wanted to do was put a 233 in there to make it go a little bit faster, because this was taking way, way too long. And of course, nostalgia is fueled by personal feelings and experience, which I've kind of already talked about. So why work on retro PCs? Frankly, there's virtually no reason to. All the useful software that can be used has been upgraded. A good example would be a word processor. So you could install WordStar on DOS and be able to edit a document and be able to print it, send it to anybody that you want. But you could also do the exact same thing on your phone. So there's really no reason to do that. Technologies change. We have the ability with faster processors, we can do more with our applications. And a good example of that would be email. So now we can have images in our emails instead of just plain text being sent around. But for me, I love discovering how computer hardware reflects the current trends, mostly related to the high expensive components at the time. So when you have a 386, this is an older generation motherboard, obviously. The 486 was just coming out. The only difference was the instruction set. And as the two technologies were in the market, computer companies started modifying their 386s to support the 486 processor. So you could buy it with a 386, and a little bit later, when the prices come down on a processor, you can buy the 486, plop it in there, get that new instruction set, and be able to use all of the new things about it. But for me, I like to also revisit forgotten features. So I have an example here, the 3DFX Voodoo and Quake. So the 3DFX Voodoo was a 3D accelerator that was used in a lot of arcade machines. It was sold as an expansion card you could put into your computer. And there was about 5 or 6 years of games that were designed specifically for that particular accelerator. You can still play them on a modern computer, but then you get the software rendering, so you don't get to see the fancy textures, the glowing lights, and of course the acceleration is kind of a moot point because it's going to run a lot faster on modern hardware. So in terms of, if you go down this path, this is getting to the point where, what did I learn? To get the most from your retro PC, there's 2 paths you can take. The obvious one is emulation. So as I mentioned, most applications can be run on a modern machine, word processors, email, whatnot. But if you're going to be playing games or you have a real need to use an old application, you can emulate it. And a good example would be the Raspberry Pi. This is a SoC. It's a little tiny box about you big. And there are projects out there that will change the firmware to the point where you can install MS-DOS. And once you get MS-DOS on there, you can install Windows 3.1. You can experience Windows 3.1 in all of its little square glory. If you wanted to play some games, for instance, there's another project called Retro and this is a project that will allow you to create an arcade machine. So if you have a ROM image from like Donkey Kong, for instance, you can create an arcade cabinet with Retro. All you need to do is hook up the buttons and the joystick, and away you go. Retro also supports games from Commodore 64, Apple II, certain DOS games as well. So that's one avenue you can take. Another avenue, which is the one that I personally like to do, is the restoration and refurbishing of old computers. Unfortunately, what you run into is that there are parts that are virtually impossible to find. And I have a video on my YouTube channel where and it's the Scam Case project. I bought a 386 computer, came out of New York. The listing showed that it had the original box for some people that you really care about that stuff. Well, it turns out that the seller decided just to put the label on the original box and ship it out. Unfortunately, inside there was no extra padding, there was no blankets, nothing, no peanuts in there. It was the original padding, the original box, and then he labeled me a scammer when I complained about it. But I was able to take that project and refurbish it, so to speak. Another process is the resto mod. And this is another parallel with muscle cars. So with muscle cars, the components in there are really hard to find. So what a lot of people do is they will take out everything that is old and replace it with a modern version. So you might be able to take out that 350 out of your Nova and put in an LS out of a Corvette. At that point, you get fuel injection, you get more reliability, in many cases, more power, and you still have the flavor because it's a V8. Well, for me, I started to look at how I could make my Pentium 133 run much like a modern PC. And to do that, I looked at the storage and at power. And my last option here for using or getting the most from your Retro PC, feed the nostalgia itch. So for me, I also wanted to play games. I have a Voodoo card. I just needed to have the hardware to put it in. So for the case projects, and these are on my expo table, so I again urge you to come by and check them out. We have the classic case build, and these are the names that I've given them. And this is a 386 40 megahertz with 16 megs of memory. And this is the SIM memory, so they're little tiny modules like this that have 3 little copper pins on them, and you need to have 4 of them because of the way the technology was set up. This project, aside from refurbishing a chassis that I found, was to also explore using Winchester hard drives. As a kid, I was fascinated by hard drives because my Tandy 1000 at the time had 2 5¼ inch floppy disks, no hard drive. So if I wanted to play a game, I needed to pull the disk out, put the disk in, load the game. And then when I exited the game, I needed to put DOS back in so that it could load that up and be able to go on to the next thing. Well, with a hard drive, you could shortcut that, much like on a modern PC. Well, it turns out that running an old Winchester hard drive like that is easier said than done. For one, they generally have or had a 5-year shelf life. That was what the manufacturer said that they were good for. Typically, you would have head crashes where the heads would physically crash into the platter, and at that point ruins all of the magnetic media. They were slow, and you needed a special controller. Unlike IDEs and SATA drives that you can put into a modern PC, you needed to have an extra controller card, special wires, you needed to format the drive for the card, then you needed to create all of the infrastructure so that you could put data on it. Nowadays, you can just plug in an SSD and away you go. The other part of that project was also refurbishment. So the motherboard would have these little NiCad batteries on them. And the nice thing that, or so to speak, nice thing, alkaline and NiCad batteries love to explode and leak. Anybody that's had an old radio will know what I mean. Well, these batteries, sometimes they would break on the motherboard within the first week of it being new back in the 80s. Sometimes they would last for 4 or 5 years, and then this motherboard would go into storage. say, I don't need this computer anymore. I don't know what to do with it. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, there was no such thing as recycling. So a lot of times they would just go in the basement of grandma's house. And as they came out and sold at an estate sale or something like that, somebody would buy these and the battery would leak and start eating all of the copper traces on the motherboard. So I would take these boards, pull them apart, rebuild the traces, and make them work again. That was the other part of the classic case build. The scam case build, this is the one that got shipped to me that was broken. I ended up, strangely enough, the 386 that I put into the classic case build came out of the scam case, so I was moving parts around. So I could put in a Pentium 133, already mentioned. The bezel was busted, so I needed to find a replacement, and that's easier said than done. Strangely enough, I got on eBay, put up an alert, and about 2 months later, I got a hit. Found one that was from a recycler in an ex-Soviet country. I forget the name. So a month and a half later, after purchasing it, it showed up. Did a retrobrite on it because it was very yellow, very smoky, strangely enough, Europe. And then was able to reassemble the computer. At this point, this is when I started to modify the build. So I used a solid state storage solution, which was basically an IDE to SD card adapter that replaced the rotational hard drive. At this point, there's absolutely zero noise, and the only limitation is the interface speed. So the speed of IDE. You don't have to wait for mechanical parts. Instead of taking 10 minutes to boot up Windows 95, it takes about a minute and a half. And then just for fun, I put in a Voodoo 2 so I could start playing Quake again. And the last project that is at my table is what I call the sleeper storage solution, although someone at the Boise LAN suggested that I call it the sleeper storage device for SSD. Basically, I took one of the broken Microscience HH1120 hard drives, a Winchester drive, 120 megabytes, I believe. It's big, now you can take pictures that are about that size. And I took the shell off the top, the faceplate and the frame, and then 3D printed innards to match up all of those components together so that I can include an IDE to SATA adapter, and then went from a SATA to SD card adapter, hooked up the activity LED so that I could have the solid state storage on the IDE to make it look like an old Winchester drive. At that point, there's no limitations. And I'm sure everybody's read this already, but did you know a Microscience HH1060, which is in the classic case build, it's $950 in 1987 when it was released, which roughly equals the cost of an RTX 3090, assuming that you can buy one or find one. Unfortunately, that went a little quick, but if anyone has any questions, speak up. And I guess there's a microphone as well.
I love this, and thank you for making me feel really old. So I built all my own machines, and I love it just as a hobby, but I also do it for work. But I've come up against, like a week ago, I just wanted a new monitor, larger, and you know what that sets off. You want a new monitor, you need a new video card, the motherboard won't handle the new video card, et cetera, et cetera. So next thing I know, I built this thing in 2011, runs like a champ. Now it's obsolete. And then I go look in my closet, I can build 10 computers off all the components in here.
I have the same problem.
I know, so I can't handle putting a perfectly good processor, motherboard, video card, zip drive in a landfill. And it's all there. So I want to possibly recycle, but there's got to be somebody out there that will do this and put them into schools, and they all run XP, which is a great operating system. I miss it. They run it great, but what do I do with all these components? Because the e-waste is such a big deal, and I don't want to contribute to that. I want to make something, donate these systems. I don't want to even make any money off of them. I just want somebody to use them because they work. Right. And I don't want to put them in a landfill. Right.
That is a very interesting question. And unfortunately, it goes back to components wear out and they get old. Windows XP machines have a limitation in the fact that they're running Windows XP, and which is a notoriously, malware-friendly operating system. But the things that you can do, there are, not around here, unfortunately. Idaho is terrible with e-waste and recycling, but there's a place in Seattle, the REPC. Everything that they take in will go into the back. It gets refurbished, rebuilt, and then put out on display. They don't, the REPC. Of course, you have to make a trip to Seattle, but they are probably one of the best recyclers that I found so far that will take the components and actually do something with them. The only thing that they send off to the recycler is stuff that's physically broken and damaged that really can never be used. But I mean, I went up there and bought 2 motherboards from them that were impossible to find. And they were just sitting in a bin. I'm like, hey, awesome, boom, boom. And then somebody came up to me from the Boise land. They are in Salt Lake. They do a very similar thing. So it's not an e-waste at that point. They go and refurbish them and then they resell them on eBay.
Same with laptops. I've got a shelf full of laptops.
The problem with laptops is that they aren't as upgradable as an actual computer. So unfortunately, those ones will probably just need to go to the recycler. Although there is one place in town, and I forget the name, but they will, if it's actually usable, they will go and try to refurbish it. No, that place, honestly, that place is terrible. That's the way I see it, at least. That's the epitome of a person building a company so that they can try to make money off of people just getting rid of stuff and hoarding all the good stuff. It reminds me of like a 70s pawn shop, stuff on the floor, dirt everywhere. But you can find some interesting stuff there. Hey, go ahead. Oh, sorry, did you have anything else?
No, I'm good.
All right, cool.
Well, the Reuseum is actually quite cool.
It is to certain people, yes. Not to me, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. And they are a non-profit.
Mm-hmm. I am aware.
Well, yeah, I was going to suggest that you could donate them there.
Yeah.
And also, I could take some of them.
Yeah. Yeah. The other popular option is set up an eBay store. I mean, that's where I bought all of the stuff that you see on the table out there in the expo hall. So I have 5 of them. Sorry. Go ahead.
So I was just curious, is there because I haven't followed vintage PC stuff specifically.
Mm-hmm.
I've looked into retro game consoles just from owning stuff and being curious what I can get stuff for. But is there, because I know that has all shot up a ton recently, value wise and resale wise. I'm wondering if there's a good era of retro PC to go for that's not going to be crazy expensive the way a Super NES is now or something.
Right. Well, that's actually a really good question because the classic case build, for instance, that's a 386 40 megahertz. In terms of on the PC side, that is as far back as I would ever suggest going. 286, 8088, they're great, but you can't do hardly anything with them. They were very, very limited at the time, and they're even more limited now. But with the 386 and above, you have options where you can install different expansion cards. Of course, this is all within a generation. You have to have your ISA cards for the 386. Pentium will give you into the PCI realm. It's not necessarily for console gaming, but you can do PC games, and you can download those off the web in a lot of cases. The other option is if you didn't want to go with the hardware side of things, a lot of DOS games will play in DOSBox. It's actually an emulator you can run through your browser in some cases. If you have a Raspberry Pi, just download one of those projects and you can do the exact same thing. And then at that point, it's all USB. So you can build your controller, plug it in. You can plug in a mouse and keyboard, run it that way. And in terms of speed, the Raspberry Pi is a lot faster than the 386, believe it or not.
Yeah, there is something magical about original hardware. Yeah,
and that's why I love this stuff. So, I talked about how one of the motherboards I have had a socket on it for 486. And it's well, why is that there? And so I had to research it. And it was well, this was made in between the time. The 486s were out. A lot of times those machines would cost $4,000 in 1985's money. That's a lot of money to invest into a computer that isn't much faster than the 386. So to sell these chips, they would build these special motherboards with options to upgrade. I also found out that Intel finally discontinued the 386 like 10 years ago. They were producing that chip all that amount of time, and it was mostly for industrial use. Crazy.
Oh, that's cool. Thanks.
Yep.
Just one thing related to 386s being discontinued like 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
as far as I know, the 6502 is still being made today.
That is correct. Yes. It's turned into more of a hobbyist platform. And part of it is because of the popularity of the Apple II and some of the other platforms that use that processor. That you can actually, on eBay, you can buy kits to put together a 68002, whatever that is, project, and actually build your own computer that way. And all with new parts. You don't even have to have any vintage parts. If you get into the VIC-20s and the Commodore 64s, some of those you need to buy a vintage chip to be able to build that computer, but you can still buy the components, which is pretty cool. Any other questions? All right. Well, hey, thanks for coming to my presentation. I can be reached at Twitter, YouTube, and on my website at hardwaresciam.com. So feel free to reach out. I like to consult. So if you have questions about stuff, I'll do my best to answer. So, oh, and come see me out in the expo floor. I'll be there until 4 or 5.